Welcome, everybody. Welcome at the United Nations Global Compact Leaders Summit 2021, arranged here with all these speakers through Thunderbird School of Global Management. And we're very fortunate to be hosting this session on stewarding the family enterprise in the post-COVID world. And for the session, we are happy to welcome two prominent speakers. Number one, Mr. Rajiv Peshavaria, and number two, Kian Seah. Rajiv, based out of Singapore, Kian, based out of Johor in Malaysia. Let me give everyone a brief introduction of the two gentlemen, then I will briefly introduce myself, and then we will dive straight into the topic of stewarding family enterprises in the post-COVID world. Rajiv is the CEO of Stewardship Asia Center, which is a non-profit center dedicated to helping business leaders, investors, and individuals, such as, for example, senior generation members and next generation members in family businesses, to activate and practice stewardship in the operation of their investments or the enterprises they lead and steward into the future. Stewardship Asia Center was created under the Temasek Trust in 2015. And most recently, for example, came out with the Singapore Stewardship Principles for Responsible Investors, which will help the investors and the individuals and the managers and business leaders to steward their enterprises into the future well. Prior to his current role at Stewardship Asia Center, Rajiv was with HSBC, Amex, and Goldman Sachs, amongst others. And he is an alumni of the University of Bombay and Webster University in Vienna. Welcome, Rajiv, and thank you very much for taking the time today.
Thank you for having me. Pleasure.
In addition, we have Kian Seah. Kian Seah is the founder and managing director of Heng Hiap Industries, based in Johor, Malaysia, commonly known as HHI. HHI, since 2002, is at the forefront of innovating plastic recycling and driving the plastic recycling industry in Malaysia through its smart plastics. What does smart plastics mean? Smart plastics means high quality plastics, recycled, customized to the needs of the clients of HHI, and recycled in a smart factory, which Kian himself designed and helped to build. Amongst other things, HHI also markets Plasthouse Ocean Plastics, which are plastics recycled and created exclusively from harvested plastics out of the ocean. Furthermore, the plastics that HHI recycles are fully tracked and traced by its proprietary digital solution, which helps the consumers understand where the plastics that they use actually come from. Very importantly, Kian is also an alumni of Thunderbird School of Global Management, where he completed his Master in International Management as a Fulbright scholar. And in our preparation call, Kian told me that all the projects he conducted at Thunderbird were in the area of plastics re-engineering. So what HHI does today essentially was incubated at Thunderbird many, many years ago. So welcome, gentlemen. Thank you very much for joining this panel, and I'm looking forward to the next 23 minutes together with you. My name is Professor Dr. Marc-Michael Bergfeld. For short, people call me Micha. I am a senior partner at Courage Partners in Singapore, which helps family offices and family enterprises prepare for the next generation and steward, Rajiv would say, steward well into the next generation. And I'm also a professor of global family business. With this and without further ado, let's jump into the topic. And let's briefly speak about what has changed during the COVID time. So we all know that COVID has not only triggered, but also intensified a couple of trends that had been around before. Number one, forced digitalization and innovation. We had to innovate across the entire supply chain. We continue to have to innovate across the entire supply chain to make sure the economy continues to work. Today, there's also an extreme emphasis on the environment. In a way, COVID was a wake-up call for all of us, and which has shown humanity what can happen when nature strikes back, quote unquote. Further, we had to learn that diverse societies need to be really inclusive, and we need to not only on a global level think about topics, but also solve them very much on a local level. A crisis such as COVID could only be managed because everyone pulled together locally, regionally, nationally, and then globally. Thirdly, last but most certainly not least, there is an abundance of capital triggered through the quote unquote flood of fiat money that tried to stabilize the markets. And this abundant capital now meets the concept of conscious capital, because what we find is that this abundant capital meets the trend of ESG, enterprise, society, and governance focused investments, not only by individual countries, such as their sovereign funds, but also by government funding agencies and multinational agencies as well. So in the future, we will have abundant capital, but it will be characterized more as patient capital or conscious capital, provided for a longer and higher time at market rate, or maybe even below market rate, to solve the big problems of humanity. So overall, COVID has shown us a realization that things can change very quickly. We need to pull together, and we need to collaborate across countries, across companies, to solve these challenges. And in a way, as we now slowly, but hopefully surely, come out of COVID, we are diving right into the next crisis, which is climate change. And let's hope that a couple of lessons learned, such as stewardship and such as the circular economy, that we've learned during COVID, can also help us to tackle the next challenge that is ahead. Therefore, let's dive in and think about stewarding the family enterprise for the post-COVID times. So stewardship, in a way, is a grand word. Originally, a steward is a caretaker and a protector. But what exactly, Rajiv, does stewardship actually mean? We're fortunate to have you here as the absolute expert. How would you explain stewardship in a couple of brief words? And then maybe in a second step, we can think about how to apply it on a day-to-day basis.
Great. So, as you said, the traditional meaning of the word stewardship is the responsible management of something that is entrusted to us in our care. Like, for example, being responsibly managing somebody's assets or capital. Traditionally, it also meant serving like a steward on a ship or on a plane, right? So we can say that traditionally stewardship was managing and serving with care. But in today's world, where we are facing unprecedented existential challenges on planet Earth and for humanity at large, I think that definition becomes a little inadequate. So we need a bigger definition of business stewardship that involves not only managing and serving with care, but also leading proactively to create a collective better future for a wide variety of stakeholders and for society at large. So in other words, today's most pressing business need, in my humble opinion, is a whole new model of leadership called steward leadership.
Wow. And we will come to Kian briefly and see how this, for example, applies in the example of HHI. But Rajiv, if we could take it one step further and maybe also use this to give our little panel discussion here a structure, would you be able to maybe share a conceptual picture or an explanation that helps us guide the rest of the discussion and also helps everyone to, on a day-to-day level, practice stewardship in a way with almost like a leadership compass? What would that look like?
You hit the nail on the head by saying the word compass, because let me share my screen here and show you, because it all begins with a compass. Just give me a second here.
Oh, wow. Very good. Excellent.
So I don't know whether you were peeping into my computer, but that's exactly the word. Just give me, yeah, there you go. So steward leadership, we define it as a genuine desire and persistence to create a collective better future, not just for myself or my shareholder, but collectively for a wide variety of stakeholders. How does this genuine desire and persistence actually come about? It comes about by actually crafting and operationalizing what we call the stewardship core compass for the organization. And has 4 very simple steps, 3 of which are foundational, and the last one, which you do every day. I'll go through them very quickly. The first is to identify the most important organizational values that will guide the organization on a day-to-day basis. And these values, most organizations already have a set of values. What turns your leadership into steward leadership is when you add 4 stewardship values to your overall set of values. And I want to spend a minute talking about what these 4 are. So allow me. The first is interdependence. Now, if you don't believe in interdependence, you don't believe in steward leadership or stewardship. Interdependence says my success is intertwined with yours, and I cannot be successful and happy alone. Now, the biggest lesson, you mentioned COVID-19, the biggest lesson that COVID-19 has taught us is this: no one is safe until everyone is safe. Yeah, no one is safe until everyone is safe, and that's interdependence personified, if you will. The next is long-term view, that we build for the long term, not only for now, but for future generations as well. We want our business to be successful over long periods of time. And it basically means, it doesn't mean that we are against short-term gains in business. What it means is don't do anything for short-term gain which will jeopardize your ability to create long-term sustainable growth, or if something that harms society or future generations. That's what we mean by long-term view. Next is ownership mentality. At the end of the day, steward leadership is a choice. It's a very personal choice for business leaders. And if we make a choice that I don't want to just create a better future for myself or my shareholder or my family, I want to create a better future for society at large through my business. I take ownership, I take proactive choice. And finally, steward leaders understand that, the long road of creating sustainable value over long periods of time for a wide variety of stakeholders is actually full of setbacks and mistakes, but I will not give up. This is the persistence part of the equation, where I will not give up come what may. I will dive into my creative resilience and actually find solutions. So that's when you add those 4 values, you now become, you declare your intention of being a steward leader. Next, you define now your stewardship purpose. How does a stewardship purpose differ from any ordinary purpose? As I've mentioned already, it creates a collective better future. It grows both economic value for the business and social value as well. We are not against profit here. We're saying make as much profit as you want, grow as much as you want, but do so, accept the challenge of 21st century leadership, do so by addressing those very challenges that humanity is facing, because if you don't solve those challenges, you won't have any markets to sell your goods to. And finally, where the rubber hits the road is this final step. Ensure that everything the organization does is aligned to and governed by your stewardship core compass. And really, I see many organizations do a great job at steps 1, 2, and 3, print beautiful posters, but when it comes to living it, some do it well and some don't. So the rubber really hits the road on step 4. So I hope that gives you some idea.
Excellent. And the rubber will hit the road in a second when we ask Kian how he implements it at his organization. But just to briefly repeat, and this will guide us for the next 15 minutes now, organizational values and maybe founders' values in the beginning, then the acceptance of interdependence, then taking a long-term view, clear ownership mentality, and creative resilience. Those are the most important building blocks, correct, Rajiv, of this of stewardship as a grand word. And by the way, this applies to any SME or any family enterprise. How it applies in practice might be different, but the concept remains the same. Perfect. So thank you very much, Rajiv. This is excellent guidance, and we will return to this and we'll structure the rest of the talk in this way as you just presented. So Kian, let's go to you and start with maybe 2 of the building blocks that Rajiv just shared. First one was the values, the roots, where does the whole idea come from? And that often for family businesses relates to family history also. And secondly, the understanding that everything is interdependent, which obviously very much applies to the recycling industry. So Kian, if you would briefly want to share what triggered your creation of the company, and how does this also relate maybe to your personal history and the values, the roots of the family? and therefore gave you the power to create this company, which today, as you told me, exports to over 35 countries. Over 70% of your products go into export, and you recycle over 60,000 tons of plastic a year. So that's a huge achievement. Where did it come from? Where did the original idea come from?
Sure. Again, thank you for having me here. So for me, rather than choosing recycling, I was actually born in a recycler's family. And here in Southeast Asia, you will see that there is a mobile pickers or scavengers that collect recyclable from household to household. That's how I started out when I was 10. So slowly we make our way up, from scavengers, mobile picker, yacht owner, processor, and finally aggregator. So from that, we actually learned a lot of things. When other people see waste, my parents teach us or taught us to see the worth in it and actually commercialize the worth out of that. And of course, from there, we actually understand that because of the fragmentation and also the lack of industrial standard, that makes it very hard for all these independent operators, or commonly known as informal communities, to work together. So from what I learned from Thunderbird, the first thing is actually to create an internal standard which we could be shared as the de facto industrial standard. Now, with that, we actually share that de facto industrial standard across 28,000 independent operators here. And the most important thing, after what we've learned earlier on, is that helps to create the framework for interdependence, for all the members to come together, and so that we can ensure the consistency, the compliance, and then towards the end, we can actually commercialize all this plastic recycling that we are doing right now. So growing up, my parents are always feeling very ashamed of being in recycling industry, because they always think that although it's hard work, you will never get the recognition for the hard and honest work that you put in. So growing up, they want us to get a degree, and number two, never become a recycler. So we did get our degree, but all of us are recycler right now. So today we are one of the largest metal scrap supplier to local steel mills, paper scrap supplier to local paper mills, and then for plastic here, which I'm basically in charge of, we are the biggest local plastic recyclers that collect local scrap to be exported to all this country that you mentioned about. Now, it's interesting that you talk about, this interdependence in the business, because what we see is that we move from fragmentation to integration. And from integration, we can ensure the circularity, which we could talk a little bit more about that, because our vision is that through this circularity, we can then move into decarbonization and then achieve the smart plastic that the smart society that we envision. So that's kind of a quick intro about HHI.
Oh, okay, thank you, Kian. And you were sharing with me earlier that you are thinking along these 5 C's, right? Collect, convert, co-create, customize, and then provide to the conscious consumer. Yeah, this is basically the interdependent system that you helped build, and maybe later we'll speak about digitalization, how you help these 28,000 people to follow your standard. And before we pass on over to long-term view, Rajiv, let me also ask you, Kian says when he thinks about interdependence in his system, nobody in the system should ever drop the ball, right? Not the collector, not the consumer, and obviously HHI in the middle, no one drops the ball. Everybody's interdependent to solve this together. Are there any other examples from your experience that make interdependence work, such as Kian mentioned in his circular economy example?
So many, but the one that comes to mind is Howard Schultz of Starbucks. When he was running Starbucks early on, he realized that the company's success depends on the well-being of its employees. Now, Starbucks employs a lot of part-time workers, and Schultz realized that they need healthcare benefits. So Starbucks became the first company in America, and perhaps in the world, to provide full healthcare benefits even to part-time workers. And if they work more than 20 hours a day, they could even participate in the company's stock option plan. Now, to me, that's a great example of interdependence because he believes that if employees are well looked after, they will make the customer happy, and that will make the company successful. And so this interdependent web of us taking care of one another is incredibly important. So, he set the standard for something that had never been done before.
Mm. And it connects very well also to long-term view, which we'll come to in a second, and I'll ask you about this, Rajiv. Maybe just to share, we had one case during COVID in our work where the family council had decided it's COVID, let's send everyone home, but let's promise to all employees that we will for sure continue to pay the salaries. Not even we don't know as owners what's going to happen. It was the very beginning. We will pay. A couple of days later, the owner comes to the warehouse, and the warehouse is, protected by employees. And he was asking, "What are you doing here? We sent you home. It's a pandemic." And the employees said, "No, sir. You took care of us. We are taking care of you. Yeah. So we're just making sure that nobody empties the warehouse while we are away." A great example of interdependence as well, right?
Exactly.
So let's go to long-term view, which obviously connects well to interdependence. How long-term are we talking, Rajiv? And how does this tie into this concept of patient capital and short-term versus long-term gains?
The length of the period is contextual and varies from situation to situation. So what might be long-term in Kian's business might be short-term in somebody else's business. So we don't actually recommend a period saying this is long-term and this is short-term. So how long is left to business leaders to decide? What we mean by long-term view here is not to do anything for short-term gain if it hurts your ability to create steady returns over long periods of time, or if it hurts other stakeholders and society. We are not against short-term gain, as I said earlier, if it doesn't hurt future ability or society. Now, clearly, Howard Schultz was thinking long-term when he took the short-term pain of increasing benefits costs at Starbucks. He was clearly a long-term thinker when he did that. And the short-term, that was going to be extra cost.
Kian, we spoke about long-term orientation too in your case. And initially you said at the moment, we might not be plastic free, but we could be plastic neutral. Now, if you take a long-term view, you said maybe because we can start recycling plastic indefinitely, we could also become plastic sort of net negative over time. How do you look at the long term when you apply it to your own organization?
Sure. I love this topic. So for us within our company, we took a long-term view by, basically fast forwarding 50 years from now. What would be the inevitable change in our society 50 years from now? And what we realize is that we will not live in a plastic-free society, rather we'll live in a plastic-neutral society. So the reason we see this is that we see that plastic can actually be recycled. Let's just say mechanically, plastic can be recycled 7 times and then molecular structure collapse. Then we go through a chemical recycling, basically cracking all this polymer, and then we make new polymer again, solely based on plastic scrap itself. And then the cycle goes on, for mechanical recycle for 7 times. And technically, we can recycle plastic indefinitely. And so what we have to achieve, what HHI is trying to do is to harvest into what we call above ground hydrocarbon. The important things about above ground hydrocarbon feedstock in our view is commonly known as plastic scrap or plastic pollution. Now, when we say plastic pollution in the eyes of HHI, there's just so much resource above ground that we could use, and so that it can have that perfect cycle, just like how water, air, and ice, the same thing can happen to hydrocarbon. Now, this is something that's very, very important for a long-term view because it reduces our dependency on fossil. And it totally rethink our entire model in plastic consumption and also plastic consumption. So it basically reset the entire plastic production and consumption. That's what I'm trying to say. And I think that's what circularity is all about. And we think this will happen sooner. It will not take 50 years. Our job is to make this happen sooner, maybe in 15, maybe in 10, maybe in 8. We'll see.
Perfect, perfect. But this has a prerequisite, Kian, right? And this links us to the next dimension, which is ownership mentality, right? Maybe I'll briefly extend the thought with Kian, Rajiv, and then I'll hand ownership mentality over to you. Because for that ownership mentality, Kian, that you just described, harvesting above ground, you will also need the consumers to be willing to co-own the plastic system and to become part of the circle. And I know that you do this with technology and with mobile. Can you briefly explain how your ownership mentality works, but even more so, the extension of that concept that you have done, if I remember correctly, with Capgemini, to provide a digital interface that you can track not only the 28,000 people that collect for you, but also those that will then use and buy the products made out of plastic and hopefully give them back to you at some point. How does that ownership mentality tie into the system?
Sure, thank you, Mika. You do sound like a very experienced recycler. That's awesome. Okay, so I'll share my experience here. So in the past, when we talk about plastic recycling 1.0, we always think that the government has to do it. Yeah, most government try to do it, mixed results. Then we have plastic recycling 2.0 that we say that producers should do it. So businesses B2B do come together and try to fix this problem. You know, big brand owners are taking up that commitment and that target to try to make some changes. We have better result, but still not enough. Now 3.0, we actually envision a more inclusive and intelligent ecosystem whereby we are creating a C to B to B type of model. We are creating a digital table, if we will, and bring the consumer to the table when we talk about circularity. And that goes back to the 5C that we talk about. I will use one example that we did. The first C is that we collect ocean plastic from Tioman Island, a beautiful island here in Malaysia. Then we convert it. The second C is convert. We convert it to a beautiful color, very high quality material in living coral, which is the Pantone color of the year in 2019. And then the third C is co-create. We design with a Dutch designer called Danny Fong with this award-winning louver chair. And then the fourth C is champion. We work with this company, which is actually the second largest furniture supplier to fast food restaurants of the world, including Starbucks and all that. And then they communicate with the consumer. And the fifth C is consumer. Because of our integration, we can actually control the entire chain of custody or the entire footprint that we actually distill all the information into a QR code. If you scan the QR code, you basically know that for that particular chair, it's almost like a birth certificate. Where does it come from? And that actually does all of that. And then we go to consumer and say, hey guys, we have the first C has passed the ball to the second, to the third, to the fourth. You are the last and fifth C now. We're going to pass that to you. Don't drop the ball and make sure that you send it back to us after that. And we ensure the entire circularity. And everybody needs to own that mentality, that circularity concept. And that will help us to achieve the circularity we talk about. Over to you.
Which is, Rajiv, what you said, steward leaders work to connect the heart and the mind, right? And so Kian was just sharing how he makes his consumers co-owners of the challenge. Would you have an additional view on co-ownership and ownership mentality? We have approximately 4 minutes left, guys, so we're well underway. So Rajiv, what do you have on ownership mentality?
So, I'll stick with the Starbucks example in the interest of time. Steward leaders imagine a collective better future and take it upon themselves to create it. They're driven by the mantra, if it's to be, it's up to me. So when Schultz stepped down as CEO of Starbucks and retained only the chairmanship role, the company's growth and profitability slowed down. Wall Street analysts suggested that the company should cut employee benefit costs because they are spending more on benefits than on raw materials. Schultz decided that that was a complete no-go, came back to the CEO role and took ownership to solve the problem differently. So that's how he looked at it. The other point I'll make on ownership mentality is the more you give and empower people with trust, the more ownership they will take. As your example earlier, that they came back to take care of the warehouse because the family took care of them.
Excellent. Which now leads us to the last building block, which would be creative resilience. Creative resilience. How would you extend ownership mentality, Rajiv, to creative resilience? Because we said, yes, we want to drive profitable growth, but at the same time, we want to uphold this spirit of stewardship in times of crisis. How would you extend the point? And then, Kian, we go back to you.
This is where leaders say, come what may, I will not give up. Such persistence and resilience comes to them because their purpose is larger than themselves. So Schultz was driven by a strong desire to create a company, quote unquote, to create a company my father never had a chance to work for. His father was an immigrant, part-time worker with no health insurance, and they were extremely poor. So he dug into his creative resilience to find other solutions for growth and profitability without giving up the generous employee benefits that Starbucks was giving to part-time workers. They just say, come what may, I will not give up.
Wow. This relates, Kian, very nicely to the beginning of our panel with your parents' story, right? So in a way, you are creating the company that your parents could never work for back then. How would you extend the view on creative resilience and not giving up and continuously learning and advancing and renewing in the case of HHI?
Sure. I love that line, Rajiv. I'm going to borrow that line. The first thing I see my parents, that's what I'll say to them today. Now, back to the creative resilience. So we actually have that whole digitalization solution all mapped out. Especially during COVID, we know that the traditional face-to-face manual would not work. We need that digitalized solution, and we are glad that we are working with our innovation venture partner, Capgemini, to enable this. Now, one of the very important things that we can actually do this is that we talk about plastic neutrality. On that app itself, let's use Malaysia as an example. Our Malaysian use 76 kilograms of plastic per capita per year. So in that app, depending how much you're contributing back to the platform or the solution, we will then give you a status of where you stand. So the minute that you hit 76, you basically achieve that individual plastic neutrality status. Now, for that, we envision this will go from individual to organization to society and later to the world. And I think this is something that will be very interesting for us to embark on. And we'll talk more about that next time.
Excellent. So in a couple of years, I told Kian we will see HHI being the Grab of the circular plastic economy. So we'll have to do a second interview in some years from now. Beautiful. So we've covered creative resilience as well. Let me just briefly summarize. So we said stewarding the family enterprise for the post-COVID time can take the compass that Rajiv was introducing in the very beginning as an orientation. And we shared some examples from HHI, from Kian in Malaysia. We spoke about the underlying values. They can often come from family history and family roots. We spoke about the interdependence in family enterprises, obviously also the interdependence of the owning family, but not only, including all other stakeholders and nature and the environment. We spoke about the long-term view. Rajiv, you said long-term can be contextual. So what is short-term for one might be long-term for the other. We spoke about the ownership mentality, and Kian extended the ownership mentality to the customers co-owning the system and working with that system. And we spoke about creative resilience in particular with regards to digital. And, you know, personally having seen how digital Singapore went during COVID was absolutely amazing as part of creative resilience. And these can be the building blocks for any family enterprise. Maybe just a last reflection for both of you, and this is an open question before we end. When I prepared with Kian said, in order to make stewardship work for HHI, I need to find believers, others that believe in my stewardship vision, and that will follow me, will help, and will collaborate with me. What is your both's point, and maybe Kian first and then Rajiv for closing words, what is your thought about believers in stewardship or believers in stewarding concepts for enterprises and also nature and society into the future? Kian.
Sure. So for us, the first thing that we are doing is to actually recruit believers, whether it's within the company, the strategic partners that we are working with. We talk to many of us, many of the potential partner. But the most important thing we look into is that whether they're believers, because within the company, we only work with believers. And I think, once we work with believers, we see that once the chemistry comes together, it will give us magic works, among believers coming together. And I think that's something that's very important. And we look for believers who believe in circularity, believers who believe in decarbonization, believers that believe that that's something that we can do now, from the low-hanging fruit project that we can do all the way up to the long term. So we work with believers who are, who could be the talent. We work with believers who are probably investing, innovation, digitalization, and even scale-up partners regionally. So for us, we are having so much fun with our believers. Over to you. What
about you, Rajiv? Believers and sort of an outlook on stewardship from the perspective of Stewardship Asia Center.
So the question is, how do you create believers? The mistake people make is, look, I am going to do something to you to make you a believer. No, that's not how followership works. The way to create believers is to articulate your stewardship core compass. First of all, put out those values out there, that this is what the organization believes in terms of values. And based on those values, this is the organization's stewardship purpose, which goes way beyond just ourselves, our family, and our shareholders. Now, people will believe in that compass. They believe in purpose. They believe in values. They don't believe in an individual. To the extent that Kian is actually living his compass of values and purpose every day through his actions, not his actions speak louder than his words. That's how believers are created. So I would say the first step in creating and recruiting believers is to articulate your stewardship values, and based on that, a stewardship purpose, which is larger than yourself. What happens is then those people who believe in that, they will come to you. And those who don't believe in it, they won't come to you, and that's fine.
Perfect. And with that, Rajiv, I think that is a beautiful outlook for anyone who is involved with or runs a family enterprise and wants to stewardship into the post-COVID world, the various dimensions we talked about, and also setting out clearly what you want to do, and then having others believe in what you formulated as your stewardship compass, and making it work day to day. And with that, I hope we've contributed to the global SME community. Thanks for Thunderbird putting together the whole agenda and inviting us, and also obviously to the UN Global Compact Leaders Summit 2021. And gentlemen, thank you for your time. Thank you for sharing your insights. And with that, we can close the session for today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.